In December of 1745, Charles Edward Stuart, the Bonnie Prince, led a series of revolts in an attempt to reclaim the throne of England for the House of Stuart. These revolts would come to be known as the Jacobite uprisings. The Bonnie Prince would ultimately fail in his attempt, leading to the end of true monarchy in England and the rise of an oligarchical gangsterism of parliamentary constitutional democracy. Throughout this series, we have laid out the spiritual framework and foundational myths that shaped modern man into what he is today. In this episode, we draw from each of the prior episodes, using previously hinted at pieces of information to explore the natural phenomenon of blood feuds, tribal society, and their implications on the rapidly encroaching attempt at global domination by a liberal occupational elite class. You are watching Western Brahmin, and this is episode 6. The modern world. Technology, progress, liberal democracy, socialism. This is where we are today. But how did we get here, and why? Throughout the last century, many thinkers and writers have touched on this phenomenon. Across the intellectual spectrum, from Julius Evola to Steven Pinker, curious minds have attempted at giving us an explanation on why modern man has gone from tribal herding and agrarian societies to capitalist and socialist technology-driven modern superstates. However, this prevailing narrative that we are taught in school and presented through modern media is that this progress has all been for the good. For those of us versed in the ancient ideas of spirituality, this idea that good can overcome evil through mankind's material creations is alarming, to say the least. From our perspective, there is only fluctuation, and with it a great evil that grows alongside this so-called good, severing the bonds of mankind and creating a disunity and disruption of nature's stability. We are not alien to this world. Mankind is just as much a part of nature as any other animal. We often look back at the Enlightenment as a positive change for mankind, but under further investigation, one could argue that the negatives have grown just as much as the positives, and in many ways, maybe worse. If you've watched episode 2 of this series, you will recall that the divine meritocratic structure of the ancient Indo-European societies was the central pillar of life in the past. The archaic forms of caste evolved into the chain of being during the Middle Ages and characterized everyday existence in the past. This hierarchical system kept the merchant class in check and held society in a position where monetary gain was unable to overcome merit and honor. From the fall of James II in 1688 to the end of World War I, that ancient system of government would grind to a halt. The merchant class, who, for centuries, had been held back by the kings of Europe, would slowly gain power with the advent of liberal democracy and the creation of state constitutions. No longer would the leaders of nations be subject to God and protectors of their own estate. The new democratically elected leaders would be influenced by their desire to gain re-election and subject to the merchant donors that supported their campaign. In modern times, these merchant class rulers justify their power over a nation through institutions such as the media, banks, and major international corporations.
We've not asked corporations to take specific actions.
I would strongly support them doing that.
To be clear, however high-minded their intentions, these CEOs are aligning their company's interests with the professional politicians running the Democratic Party.
But as we know, every yin has a yang. For the merchants, it is the feudal races, Tribes of men who, whether through genetic or customs carried down over the centuries, have become a thorn in the side of the mercantile elites of today. Throughout this series, I have tried to conceptualize the world as we know it through the lens of the Indo-European worldview, in contrast to the modern post-war mindset that we are taught. Episode 4 may have seemed a bit out of place. I discuss the tribal spirit of the Native Americans, who themselves share a genetic affinity with the Indo-Europeans, and how a foreign ideology was introduced to their tribal way of being. We left off in episode 5 explaining the warrior code, a mindset that is completely alien to the railroad tycoons who brought mercantilism to the American West. Just as the K-strategist Neanderthals came into conflict with their R-strategist Homo sapien cousins in episode 3. Time and time again throughout history, tribal societies threatened the dominance of this new elite, and in the more extreme cases, put their wine bars to sword and flame. The Jacobites would play a crucial role in the history of England, and even the founding of America. Other groups such as the Pashtuns of Afghanistan would become one of modern America's toughest adversaries, and others such as the slowly emerging and yet loosely defined dissident right that is emerging in modern counterculture will become the future of these feudal groups who find themselves at odds with global domination and instead choose to align themselves with honor, respect, and true freedom. The Pashtuns, an Indo-European speaking ethnic group that lives in modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, are one of the great people. The Pashtuns are believed to be descended of the Saka, a branch of the Scythians who entered the region around the time of the Aryan invasion of India. The Rig Veda makes mention of the Pashtuns as comrades of the Aryans who, quote, had a love for spoil and heroes of war. The Pashtuns follow an ancient tribal code known as Pashtunwale. Elements of Pashtunwale likely go all the way back to the Indo-Aryan tribes that entered the region 3,500 years ago, and could even be remnants of Yamnaya steppe herding traditions. Understanding the mindset of Pashtunwale is difficult for Westerners. We live in a culture that sees our ancestors and historical traditions as oppressive, which has built a sense of shame. According to Yasmin Aftab Ali, Pashtuns believe that their social code produces men who are superior to those produced under the Western model, and they have no desire to have any new social system imposed on them by outsiders. In Pashtunwale, there is a concept known as badal, which means to seek justice or to take revenge against wrongdoers. There is no time limit to when this injustice can be avenged. If badal is not exercised, the offended man or his family will be considered stripped of honor. The exercise of this principle can lead to generations of bloodshed, feuds, hundreds of lives lost for one insult. It requires a violent reaction to the insult or death or injury inflicted. A badal usually ends with a badal. An action elicits or demands an equivalent response, and the cycle goes on. Pashtun at all times is expected to defend his land, family, women, and property against invaders. Honor of his name must be defended. Lives are laid down to defend the honor associated. This is Ture, which means bravery. This is another component of the Pashtun Wale. Other tenets include Sabat, meaning loyalty, towards one's friends and family and members of the tribe. Imandiri, meaning righteousness, striving for goodness both in word and in deed. Respect towards all. Gierat, courage and honor. At all times, a Pashtun must display courage. If he has no giharat or honor, he fails to make the grade as a Pashtun. Namus, meaning the sexual honor of women. For a man and his family, Namus means sexual integrity and chastity of women in the family. The Pashtun must defend the Namus of the women of his household. This extends to the Namus of his extended family as well. Nang, or honor. A Pashtun must protect the honor of those around him. Though the Taliban was originally created by Pakistani students as a means to stifle the rise of Pashtun nationalism in the 1990s, many Pashtuns have been coerced to join the cause, which, contrary to their traditional allegiances to their tribe, the Taliban is a force driven by religious fundamentalism. The Pashtunwale Code has fortified the Pashtun people with a will to fight and a sense of honor that has brought them to victory over both the USSR and the United States. Many lessons can be learned from these ancient people, how they put family, culture, and tradition at the top of their motives, and how they are willing to ride out the storm and fight to preserve the things that they hold most dear. Europe, on the other hand, has gone through dramatic changes over the centuries. Tribal customs seem far away and distant to the people of the West. But even with the introduction of Christianity and the fall of monarchy, some groups still display the similar codes of honor. In episode 7, we will take a look at Central Europe and the rise of the House of Hohenzollern in Prussia and the Habsburgs of Austria. But for now, let's travel from the mountains of Afghanistan to the Isles of Britain. The English Civil War began in 1642 and was comprised of two major factions, the Loyalist Cavaliers and the Parliamentary Roundheads. The Cavaliers were supporters of the Stuart monarchy, who were the traditional absolutist rulers that followed a concept known as the Great Chain of Being. This concept is, for all intents and purposes, a Christianized version of the ancient Indo-European spiritual hierarchy. In Hinduism, the concept known as Dharma is the closest living pagan version that still exists today. During this era, the Protestant Roundhead faction used every available political tool, such as the new media source, the printing press, to undermine and overthrow the sitting King Charles I, ultimately resulting in his execution and the installation of the dictator Oliver Cromwell. The Protestants were mostly made up of East Anglian merchants whose ambitions were held in check by the Stuart monarchs. Certain factions of the rapidly growing international trading companies, such as the Dutch East India Company, who would become the world's first corporation, found themselves at odds with the monarchs of their host nations. Previously, throughout history, merchants were limited by technology, but during the 1600s, men such as Ferdinand Magellan had sailed around the globe, and places such as the New World in Africa held vast riches, such as the gold and slave trades. Slavery, which was a norm throughout the course of history, took on a new form with the rise of the merchant class. Before the rise of the international slave trade during this era, slaves were usually people who committed crimes or were the spoils of war. The slave trade, along with other commodities such as spices, tobacco, and grain, would take on a whole new form as merchants gained more and more power from the monarchs of the West. The death of Charles would give rise to a new movement. The peasant farmers and aristocratic families who opposed the new Commonwealth of England were known as Jacobites, Jacob being a Latinized version of James. Many of these Jacobites were Scottish Highlanders whose history, from Viking warlords and endless border wars against the English, had turned them into a mountain-dwelling, battle-hardened race of men, not unlike the Pashtuns. Many modern historians tend to point to the rule of James and the Jacobite uprisings as a Catholic versus Protestant phenomenon. However, though its early beginnings were largely based on Catholic opposition to Protestantism, the Jacobites were made up of not only Catholics, but Presbyterians, Protestants, and even Quakers. The Glorious Revolution, which was more of a coup, could be described more accurately as an overthrow of England by Dutch merchants. Rule over England would swing from side to side during this period, with James ultimately being deposed in favor of William of Orange. A common theme throughout history, and something I will bring up often in this season's episodes, is the alliance of the urban upper middle class and the merchant elites, in contrast to the land-owning peasants and the aristocracy. In the British Isles, the English Civil War is the point in time when this dynamic becomes concrete and was the beginning of modern politics as we know it. The Highland clans, such as the MacDonald and Campbell clans, lived under a code very similar to Pashtun. The blood feuds and the ethics of camaraderie can be seen in local folklore and writings of the era. The Jacobite uprisings throughout the early 1700s would prove to be a serious threat to the Hanover rule of England, with many believing their rule to be illegitimate. The merchants realized that a republic was not what the people of England wanted, and disguised their rule behind a puppet king and a constitution. Supported by Scottish Highlanders, Bonnie Prince Charlie was given 2 ships by the French, who at the time saw conflict in England and a Catholic monarch as being in their best interest. The Bonnie Prince was a talented and popular young man, but with his final attempt at gaining the crown in 1745, would ultimately lose to the forces of progress. Even though the Bonnie Prince did not regain the British crown, the Jacobite cause would not die out. And this is a message that is far more important than I think a lot of modern people realize. Throughout the 16 and 1700s, the Jacobite movement was also having an effect on the British colonies, namely the colonies that would come to be known as the United States. The aristocratic cavaliers that supported the Stuarts did have a safe haven in the Americas. Many of these cavaliers would escape the turmoil of Britain by founding the colony of Virginia. Maryland, named after Mary, Queen of Scots, was founded as a Catholic colony. After the beheading of Charles, many Catholics and Stuart loyalists would make the journey to the New World to find refuge in these colonies, whereas the opposite would happen in the Protestant and Massachusetts colonies, where many settlers returned to England. Throughout the course of the English Civil War, many of the more rebellious Loyalists made their way across the Cumberland Gap into the Appalachian backcountry. Deep in the Allegheny wilderness, a culture of tribalism carried over from Highland Scotland and North Britain would flourish. After the fall of James II, Virginia would no longer be a safe haven for Jacobite sympathizers, pushing more and more colonists westward. In this hostile environment, the only thing that mattered were kin. With constant attacks by natives and suspicion towards anyone deemed foreign, clans naturally emerged, just as they had in the ancient Indo-European cultures. Almost everyone is familiar with the famous Hatfield versus McCoy feud. This type of feuding is not only common, it was the norm. Families lived close to one another and banded together in times of conflict. In the north of Britain during the late 1500s, it was noted the Armstrong clan could field an army of 3,000 mounted men upon news of a conflict, and the Hall family was so violent that they were to be given no quarter when captured. The terrain of Appalachia created a unique system of territory where families would occupy valleys created by runoff and creeks known as hollers. An entire holler would be populated by people sharing a common surname, who would build a complex network of allies through marriages with other families in the area. The people of the backcountry were considered to be extremely conservative and stuck in their ways. A passage from the book Albion Seed states, quote, "Long after losing its reason for being, family loyalty retained its power in the American backcountry. An example was the persistence of the family feud, which continued for many centuries in the Southern Highlands. These feuds flowed from the fact that families in the borderlands and backcountry were given moral properties which belonged mainly to individuals or other English-speaking cultures. Chief among them were the attributes of honor and shame. When one man fortified honor in the backcountry, the entire clan was diminished by his loss. When one woman was seduced and abandoned, all her menfolk shared the humiliation." Beneath these three groups, and many others, lies a common spirit, a mindset rooted deep in the past. The same organic system of unity through blood and family that existed on the Pontic-Caspian steppe somehow always reappears when man is not held down by a governing body that seeks to stomp out these natural tendencies. The communist thinker Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels believed that these people were not capable of conforming to their communist utopian ideals. A famous letter once noted the following, quote, "People stuck in feudalism, like the Slavs, as well as the Basques, Britons and Scottish Highlanders, could not progress straight from feudalism to communism. They would have to be exterminated, so as not to keep everyone else back. They were racial trash, as Engels called them, and fit only for the dung heap of history." As we continue to slip into the darkness of socialism in the West, one might wonder if these ideas still persist in the minds of Marxist academics that infest our universities and medical institutions. Possibly the most corrupt family in modern times, the Sackler family, owners of Purdue Pharma, were listed as members of the Communist Party of the United States during the 1930s. Purdue used Appalachian coal mining towns as a testing ground to push OxyContin, leading to the utter devastation of the region and of the American working class as a whole. Could it be the case that tearing apart the ancient tight-knit culture of Appalachian families was to them an added bonus to the billions of dollars in profit? Could it be that the hundreds of vaccines that American children receive year after year are having an effect on our national tendency toward this ancient way of life, making us more docile and complacent? Even the Pashtuns have been affected by these global elites. In the 1990s, Pashtun nationalism was on the rise in Afghanistan, but was quickly replaced by the religious extremism of the Taliban, an organization that was created by Pakistani students with the aid of the CIA. When we look at the interests of many of these international corporations that have flourished since the fall of the great kings of Europe, it would seem that they often promote ideas that are in opposition to the nuclear family, conservation of tribal customs, and the bolstering of a self-sustaining independent community, with many supporting openly communist groups such as BLM. If it wasn't already apparent, 2020 has lifted the skirt of the merchant class occupants of power, showing us that they will go as far as fortifying elections and forcing the population into a state of total control to achieve their goals. Just as they used the printing press in the 1600s to promote the beheading of Charles I, the ideological descendants of these same groups are using social media as a tool to sway public opinion now. The crucial reality that thinkers like Marx fail to realize is that nature itself is futile, and the reason societies like that of the Appalachians, Highland Scots, and Pashtuns will continue to emerge is because the spirit of vitality and freedom is what breathes life into mankind. It is the breath of fire, the animal that has escaped the Garden of Eden, confused by his surroundings yet driven by purpose. The natural, the noble, the beautiful. The men who tamed the horse and designed the chariot and lived their lives beyond the clutches of conformity. In the book Bronze Age Mindset, Bapp points out that a chimp only masturbates in captivity. The society forming around mankind currently seeks to capitalize on your confined desire to pleasure yourself. Locked in your cage, looking for the special edition pressing of your record collection, or channeling your spirit of conquest into buying the jersey of your favorite football team. This reality is becoming stale, leaving many young men searching for more. As the leash of mankind draws tighter, more and more young people are finding themselves at odds with a society that wants to turn them into a cog in the machine. A tribal consciousness is bubbling in the belly of the beast. You must ask yourself, how willing are you to stand up for your ancestors? During the Great Famine in Ireland, many people survived on only potatoes. Millions of people died, and life was much more difficult than many have it today. But what if life becomes hard once again? What will you do? The time may come when those of us still honor our ancestors, those of us who honor the Indo-European tradition, may be pushed to the edge. When that time comes, you will have to ask yourself a very, very important question.